This is the Westminster Standard Podcast. I'm Ryan Beasy. Welcome. Today, joined by a slew of returning guests, some who haven't been guests on this program for a while. George Sayour, you're returning from your 50-episode suspension. Glad to have you back. Adam
Yeah.
Parker, Joshua Walker, still moderator of Arizona Presbytery there, Josh?
Yes.
Wow. And Adam, are you...
I have no cool titles except senior pastor.
Okay. Well, you may be the only senior
that's a cool
pastor
title.
on this program, so that's something.
Guest on the Westminster Standard. You can put that on my byline.
Yeah, and it's better than my byline, which is absolute clown. So there's that.
I thought you were going to say host of the Westminster podcast.
Yeah, I could put that. But so I want to talk to you all about sabbaticals today. Josh Walker, you're on sabbatical right now, taking a sabbatical from your sabbatical to talk about sabbaticals on a podcast. So where does this concept of sabbaticals originate? Nobody knows.
No, I have no idea.
Any of you. Our minister to state in Florida. Where do we get this idea?
I don't know the history of it in church history, but clearly the scriptures, call out a Sabbath, and also you see land in the Bible getting a Sabbath rest after 6 years. So I don't know when it came into pastoral ministry or like you were talking earlier in the academy. So no idea.
Yeah,
I think extended ministerial leave has been something that has been a part of church history, but whether or not you use that terminology of sabbatical, I think is neither here nor there. I mean, maybe it's important, maybe it's not.
Yeah, that's a great point that you make, Adam, that sometimes people are only against something when it has a term. But when people are just doing it, it's they can define it. But yeah, I think ordinarily fields that have sabbaticals, professional fields, not agricultural fields, to be clear, professors. I remember one of my professors in college, he was on sabbatical, and they brought in some guy to fill in, and then pastors get sabbaticals. Can you think of any other field where you get a 12-week or 16-week paid break?
Well,
Teachers.
I just met this past week with the headmaster of our Christian school who's in the middle of his sabbatical.
Yeah.
So
it is kind of an academic. Now, is that for those teachers and professors? Usually you're expected to, at the end of your sabbatical, have produced some piece of work. Is that the case for the headmaster or the school teachers you referenced, George?
Well, no, I'm just making the point that every year school teachers get 3 months off in the summer, a month off throughout the year. And I'm allowed to critique that perhaps because I've been a certified Florida educator for 8 years. Yeah. But every year there's that season off.
Yeah. And I remember getting, when I was thinking about becoming a school teacher, they would say, well, it's not really 3 months off in the summer because you've got continuing education and lesson planning.
It's like 2 months, but
historically,
now all the teachers are going to attack us, and that's where we're underpaid, and you got the whole story. But the point is, every summer there's 2 months off. You have a week in the fall, a week in the spring, 2 to 3 in the winter, 10 paid holidays. But only pastors are the ones that get beat up for having sabbaticals. So
I don't know.
I just angered everybody, and I'll probably be on another 50-week ban from this show.
Well, but yeah, I think that people do misunderstand the workload. I taught school for a semester, and it was exhausting, and it was only like 3 classes, so it wasn't even a full load. But we definitely needed every break, and they messed up my contract because I was doing it for 1 semester, but they didn't change the number of PTO days that I got, so I still got 7 PTO days, and then when I used up like 4, they were trying to make me pay for the others, and I said, no, it's in my contract. I was that kind of guy. But Adam, you've done some research about sabbaticals historically, longitudinally. Can you talk about that? pastoral
Yeah.
sabbatical is.
Yeah, I mean, again, the terminology of sabbatical is pretty 20th century, which already makes it suspect in our circles, right? If if it came around the same time period when Machen got kicked out of the Presbyterian Church, then it's probably suspicious. But again, one of the things that I found was you run into a lot of examples of ministerial burnout. You run into guys like Philip Melanchthon, right? Philip Melanchthon ends up in the midst of the Reformation, of course, which that's a different period, but still
He was
similar.
Luther's drinking buddy, wasn't
What's that?
he was Luther's drinking buddy, wasn't he?
Yeah, I mean, that's how the Reformation happened. They just drank and preached. But Melanchthon has this physical collapse that happens. You look at chapter 22 of Here I Stand, and Roland Bainton talks about this time period that's very hard on Luther and Melanchthon, and he has a collapse and he stops eating, falls into a near catatonic state, and Luther has to forcefully intervene. You've got Luther who's always suffering, and oftentimes it's physical. But one of the things that you start to realize is that a lot of these men have to take extended breaks because they are physically breaking down. They're pushing themselves as hard as they can. They're very hardworking men. But even they are still men with feet of clay. They're still limited and still finite. And so they have these bouts of exhaustion that leave them incapacitated. And in their cases, a lot of it's not preventative. A lot of it is really responsive. Once they break down, then they're gone for months, and then they come back. If you read James Bratt's biography of Abraham Kuyper, more than once he has a nervous breakdown, and a lot of times the recovery is far worse than if he had just gotten some rest. You have John Owen, who talked about how he worked so hard that he actually believed he shortened his life and shortened his ministry and his capacity to actually serve. And he reflects on this at times. Crawford Gibbons' biography of John Owen, he talks about that. So over and over again, you actually see that these guys that we in some ways hold up as real, heroes of ours, we think of them as tough guys. Spurgeon would be a really good example. Of somebody who we think of him as somebody who's just a machine, Energizer Bunny, but he actually does way more than a sabbatical. I mean, he's taking months off every year.
Months. And he's going out of the country too, right?
He's going to France during
France.
the winter, so he's getting out of England, and he's just getting a break, and he needs it. And he has a lot of reflections on this. And I mean, I found all kinds of quotes, but one of the things Spurgeon said was, he said that work that's spent in rest is not wasted. Now, assuming the man is really a servant of the Lord and is pouring himself out, the idea of taking a break, if he's doing it in good conscience, he's going to come back better than ever, and he's going to be far more useful to God's people. Now, there is something that's be said for lazy people who just want to sort of take advantage, and maybe where there's a fear of that out there. But I think a servant of the Lord who's pouring himself out may very well find that he's going to run up against the wall at some point or another.
And George, isn't that what Moses' father-in-law Jethro said to him? You're going to burn out. You need to shift the workload in Exodus 18.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a great passage about leadership, and but like for some of us, we feel the weight of that and the ownership for it. And quite frankly, in some churches, in some contexts, the congregation expects the senior pastor to be all things,
Mm-hmm.
And so I often found like the people that would tell me, you're going to burn out and you need to delegate. And it's like, yeah, okay, thanks for that. I mean, I'm kind of known for being able to lead and delegate and all that, but it's those same people that would tell me that when it was their thing, either their crisis or their preference that wasn't being addressed in the way they wanted and didn't get my direct attention, but through somebody that I delegated, maybe an associate pastor or something, that was, evidence to them that I'm not doing my job because it's like, well, I thought you wanted me to delegate. Oh, just not your thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's certain classes of people that the senior pastor doesn't have to deal with, but you're in the class that, and so like, I've often seen people in the hospital and they get visited by 3 elders and their wives, an assistant pastor, And like one of the first things I'm hearing from people is, yeah, but George didn't come visit me. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you're being cared for by the shepherds of this church. But if, and, you know, I did visit you, it was just 3 weeks ago. And in the intervening time, others visited you. So there, in other words, I guess what I'm highlighting is like, you know, we can have all that, you know, Moses in Exodus and, you know, the delegation and plurality of eldership, but there is a level that the people in the church, when it's their crisis or their preference that's not being addressed, they expect, you know, the pastor or the senior pastor to be the one to give it the attention that they want. And if not, they don't think he's doing his job.
Yeah, and especially as a pastor of a small church, not only do you have to do all the pastoral things, but you're wearing almost every hat you could think of. I'm the IT guy, I'm the janitor, I'm the handyman, I'm the exterminator, like whatever else. Like I'm my hands in almost all of it to some degree or another. As the church gets bigger, as you start to get elders and deacons, you are able to start delegating those things. But as a pastor of a small church, virtually nothing gets done at the church that doesn't at least to some degree or another have to pass through my desk before it gets done. And it just, you know, you're doing all of these things. And most of them, I have no official training in doing. I wasn't prepared to do any of this stuff. During COVID, for example, I would often tell people when I was in seminary, we didn't have a class on global pandemics. Like I missed that one. That elective wasn't offered for us. And so we had to kind of figure that out as we were going. And if you bumped your toe, you were not given a lot of grace from a lot of people in trying to figure out this thing that we haven't seen for 100 years in the church, that you know, in America, and trying to kind of find our way through that. And I'm sure all of us made mistakes here and there on trying to suss through that. But again, that's just an example of the many different ways that pastors are trying to do it all.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And I think the church. Oh, go ahead.
No, so I just want to say I'm not here complaining. I'm, you know, and I've said this on my own podcast and on X. I never complained about any of that, but there's a reality that if we're going to attack and judge pastors for, you know, you have to understand what we're dealing with, and most people have no clue. But that's not a complaint, you know. That's not a, yeah.
It's just reality. And Josh, as you point out, you know, there's a dynamic that people, you know, oftentimes, at least in my experience, it's the big churches that are having in the call package, you know, sabbatical after 84 months or whatever it is, 3 months sabbatical after 84 months of employment or something like that. And that's great. I mean, I would never begrudge a guy a sabbatical, but often, you know, there's the dynamics that, you know, as a church, I think I've seen a chart, like a church of 0 to 50, the pastor is expected to be at everything. Whereas a church of 500, the pastor's not expected to do much beyond leadership development, preaching. And so it's just a different level of demand that, you know, I remember when I was serving at as an intern at a rather large congregation. And, you know, when the senior pastor was in a Sunday school class, it was a big deal. And, you know, he was gracious enough to fill in for me one week. I was teaching it was called the couples class. But it used to be called the young couples class right after World War II when that class was founded. And but they colloquially called themselves the survivors class by the time I taught them. But, you know, it was a big deal when I asked the senior minister, hey, would you fill in for these, you know, for me and these septuagenarians? And he graciously agreed. But it's just a different dynamic that you deal with at different levels. But, you know, let's try to think about that with ruling elders. I know, George, on your podcast, you talked about ruling elders getting a sabbatical from the work of the eldership. But let's see, where is that? I got something here from Gabe Williams, who talks about, well, you know, the sabbatical that I got was to go to General Assembly, and it was from his real job. So, you know, a ruling elder gets a sabbatical from maybe session, but he still has to punch into his 8 to 5 job every day. So how is this? What do you say to a guy who says, well, why does a teaching elder get a sabbatical, but a ruling elder doesn't get a sabbatical from his job?
Yeah, I would tell them if any ruling elder came to me and said that, I'd say, if I'm your boss, I'd love to give you a sabbatical. I think you should try to get a sabbatical. I think that we should work for ways to try to figure that out if there's a possible way to do that. I know a lot of ruling elders tend to be self-employed, so we could work about ways of figuring out how could we do that? What are ways that we could work towards doing that? Um, so I wouldn't look at it as a kind of, well, you don't have all the problems I have or all the stressors I have, so you don't need it. I would just say, no, let's try to work towards that.
Yeah.
And I think, as we've already mentioned in this podcast, this isn't unique to pastoral ministry. I think a lot of different occupations, I think of first responders with all this the stuff they deal with, should kind of start looking at ways to help these individuals with longevity to do that sort of thing. Maybe not as extended as pastors get if they can't make it work, but at least some extended time off to be able to process what they're going through, to deal with it, to rest from it, and to be able to come back more refreshed and better to do the job that's set before them.
And
Yeah. So, yeah, I did mention that on my own episode, and I've often spoke of, teaching elders understanding the unique challenges of ruling elders and accommodating their schedules, not forcing them to accommodate your work-life balance because they really don't have any. But like I've been both, obviously, maybe not obviously, but I've been open.
yeah, you've been
about
both a teaching elder and a ruling elder, right?
right,
And a ruling elder on staff, and as well as a ruling elder with a Procter and Gamble job.
yes, actually, I was a ruling elder as a teacher, and also while I was running businesses. And I remember as a ruling elder, I would work 45 to 50 hours. I was running these businesses. I was also doing like a second job to help make more income so my wife could be home. So I was tutoring because I was a certified teacher too, 5 to 10 hours a week. I was writing articles that's another story, but I was getting paid for that. I know that's hard to believe with all the typos I have on my texts and X, but I was a paid writer. I still have the paychecks from the New York Times. That'll be for another episode. But then
You are colleagues with David French?
No. But all this to say, so I'm doing all those things. Plus we have young kids, and I couldn't wait to be serving in the church. So I'm putting in 10 hours a week at the church, whether it was teaching Sunday school classes or helping do things administratively or leading in on some shepherding things. And no matter how stressful my work got and life got, it was almost like relief for me to be serving in the church. And as a pastor, you don't get that. Your life, your family life, your social life, your career life, and your worship life are all one thing. And that's just a different animal. It's a different, when there's no, I don't want to use the word escape, but I'm at a loss for a word. When there's no outlet for, when everything, all the Venn diagram becomes one circle, there's an added pressure and stress there that you will never understand, even if you're working more hours in other fields, because for you, the church is a refuge. And that's the way it should be for pastors too. But at the end of the day, if all those circles of your life become one and you're there morning to night, it's just a different level of stress that you're not going to understand.
Yeah, my wife and I call that kind of overlapping of the Venn diagrams as living in the fishbowl.
Yeah.
Kind of we're always on, we're always hosting, we're always doing something, and our friend group is our church, is our where we go to worship, is my job. It's all one constant thing. So yeah, there's no compartmentalizing, there's no breaks in that sense. Even when you take a vacation, kind of at least for me as a pastor of a small church, I would have to do all the work for my vacation the week before. I would have to make sure everything was
Yeah.
ready the week before. All the bulletins were ready, all of our song sheets, everything was planned, everything was lined up, even when I'm going on vacation. And most of the time, I'll go on vacation and still come back and lead the worship service while technically on vacation. Still come back and lead the liturgy on that Sunday. Somebody would fill the pulpit, but I would still be in worship that day, even while I'm supposed to be on a week's of vacation. So it's just kind of never ending kind of thing.
Well, and as a senior pastor or any pastor of a church, like you're not like for congregants who the church is just that refuge, and it should be, and praise God, and there's no expectation on you. You're just there, and for the senior pastor, every interaction is you're the pastor. Every interaction. There's not, I mean, like you hopefully have some close friends, and I did in the two churches I served, and I could be a little, be more loose with that. But every conversation is potential for coming up later in whatever context. People are always fishing for information on the controversies or on the color of the paint that the sanctuary is going to be. I mean, like, honestly, like I'm not, it's, so you're never not on. When you're there, you're always on, always 100% of the time. Yeah.
And Adam, this isn't complaining. This is because you love the church, right?
Yes.
You're always on because you love these people.
Oh, totally.
You're pouring yourself out. Yeah, you're pouring yourself out into these people. And that's kind of the metaphor that I've used for a lot of people, is that, for 7 years, I've been pouring out into the congregation. So I'm going to take a little bit of time here on a sabbatical to fill up, to be poured into myself, so that I can then come back and for 7 more years or longer, if I don't get a sabbatical, then that's fine. But continue to pour out into God's people as much as I can. And it's a joy. Yeah, none of this is complaining. None of this. I signed up for this. I love what I do. My job is immensely rewarding, but that just doesn't mean that there's also not an exhaustion to it that's real. I wake up at 2 a.m. with sermon ideas and jump out of bed and run to my computer and type out a sermon illustration that I had a dream about, because I'm dreaming about my church and my people and how to help them, because I love them so much that they're just constantly on my mind. So I dream about stuff and I wake up and go, oh, that was a good idea. I'm going to hop out of bed real quick and write that down. That's just an example of, maybe I'm weird and peculiar in that regard, but that's stuff that I do as a pastor because I'm so committed to doing this.
Well, I think one thing that happens, though, is in these conversations, a lot of times there is a one-to-one comparison that's made between somebody who's working in, I'm going to call it a secular field just to be lazy. All right. Somebody who's not working in the church, who doesn't get the sabbatical. And then they go, the pastor does. This isn't right. So there is this assumption that it's a one-to-one, that the same way that a pastor recovers is going to be the same way that a plumber recovers. And there is a need, I think, for people to understand that the work of ministry is not plumbing, that we're not churning out widgets, that a sermon isn't an industrial scale model where we can just sort of generate these things and they come out every week, and you can just step away from the machine.
I mean, Grok does that.
Well, yes.
I
realize that's how you made it.
Where do you guys get your sermons?
From all these books on my desk right here.
There's this great quote from Spurgeon, but I just all kinds of his lectures to his students are just a goldmine for some of this stuff. But Spurgeon says, all mental work tends to weary and depress, but ours is more than mental work. It's heart work, the labor of our inmost soul. After pouring out our souls over the congregation, we feel like empty earthen pitchers, which a child might break. And I think that's a picture of a guy who is really giving everything that he's got. And then if you go even further back, there's this interesting message that John Chrysostom gave. It's called The Service of the Priesthood Greater Than All Other Services, which you can already tell from that title what he's thinking about. And I won't read the whole quote, but he basically says, look, if you lose a sheep, then that's going to be distressing. You're going to have to replace that sheep. But a minister cares about the souls of people, and that will keep him up at night. And that is just different. It's just not the same. Now, you can say that, and that's not complaining. And I am concerned that everything we say here, of course it's X or whatever, it's going to get turned to the worst possible reading of it. But I think if someone's listening in good conscience and they're trying to hear what's really being said is it's not a one-to-one comparison. And so you just kind of have to take it from a minister when he says, I'm burned out, or I'm afraid I'm going to burn out. And I'm afraid that I actually do need this rest. And I think that should be, in good conscience, you should be able to listen to that.
Well, and I think, a conversation like this, which I hope does not come off as complaining, but especially with that historical background that you gave, Adam, is, yes, a minister, he will work himself until he dies, or has to go into the hospital for exhaustion. I mean, at the first church I served, one of my elders, Terry Howard, godly clerk of session, he said, Ron, you've got to watch out. Harold, the predecessor, he would just work and work and work, and then he'd end up in the hospital for 3 or 4 days because he was so exhausted. You need to do whatever it is to forestall that. And with those historical examples of real giants in the faith, and Melanchthon, that one of the things to encourage ruling elders would be make sure that your pastor is not doing that. A dear brother at the church I currently serve, the Lord's Day after I was called, he preached a sermon on Exodus 18 entitled "How to Kill Your Pastor in 3 Easy Steps." And it was satirical. It was a godly satire, showing the people these are things you need to watch out for to steward your pastor's time, and to promote longevity in the congregation. But I kind of want to flip it, if it's okay. And I do think that laziness is a concern, and it has been. They make Jane Austen was writing about lazy ministers. So there have been lazy ministers at least since the Regency period. George, we may disagree about this, but I kind of get offended when a guy who's preaching 40 times a year and has been in the ministry for 5 years is, well, I just need a sabbatical. Like, you're not even preaching once a week. What do you need a sabbatical for? So why am I wrong, George?
Yeah, I mean, if the assumption is that's all the church is Sunday morning, well, then the joke is, you only work 4 hours a week or something. And I do think, there's what is the expectation at the church, and a lot of what we're saying, it has to be church by church. And I think Josh already brought up the different size of a church. So a solo pastor certainly is different than a large pastor and a middle church. Has tons of stuff on the calendar, is essentially a social club. And like you've already alluded to, the pastor's expected to be there for everything. That's just a different thing than if your church has nothing else except for Sunday morning worship, Lord's Day worship, and evening, and maybe life groups. That's a different animal. I mean, I know a few pastors, and I've joked with them, and they're people we know. I'm like, you get the greatest job in the world. You get to preach twice on Sunday, and you can visit who you want, and you're not dealing with problems in your church, and there's no activities on the calendar, none. Like, yeah, of course. Well, then maybe that pastor doesn't require a sabbatical because his week isn't full of all this stuff that honestly we probably shouldn't be doing as pastors. But broad evangelical culture is the church is a social club, and the pastor needs to be there. I mean, I remember at the church I just came from, which I love very much, and all that, but they added a Saturday morning men's Bible study. The elders did, and it was great, and I'm glad they did. And the pastors didn't go. I didn't go, and my associate didn't go, and my assistant didn't go. We all had kids. It's a Saturday. It's like one day off that we supposedly get, a week basically. And then there became rumblings within the church and in certain, it was like, well, why aren't we have this Bible study and there's not a pastor there? And it's like, well, I didn't tell you to schedule the Bible study, but I'm glad you're doing it. And I'm happy you're doing it. And, I go to the couple breakfasts we have on Saturdays, but no, I'm not. Every time something gets scheduled, I'm not going to be there. So, I think, yeah, if all you're doing is preaching 40 times a year and there's no other pastoral responsibilities, well, then, yeah, you probably don't need a sabbatical. But like our church, and I know I'm talking a lot, so I'll shut up in a second, but like our church didn't have Sunday evening worship. It didn't. That wasn't my choice. It just didn't. And I only preached about 40 times a year because I had 2 other pastors, and I wanted to make sure that they were developing and using their gifts. I would tell them, like, don't tell me you don't have time to do your rest of your job, because I don't need the break. Like, I loved preparing and preaching sermons. But I also taught probably 3 times a week in different formal contexts. And every issue and every discipline case and all of that we're dealing with. So I think it depends on what church life is like,
Yeah, and I think
Right.
one of the ways that I've also been viewing sabbaticals is kind of in the mode of kind of maintenance. You don't wait until your car is on fire before you change the oil, right? Before you've
What?
seized the engine and it doesn't work anymore. Yeah, you should be changing your oil regularly, Ryan. I know that's news to you, but
Really?
yeah,
Ryan
right.
just buys new
There's
cars.
I just
yeah,
yeah,
that's
I just put gas in it, and then when it dies, I just go get.
buy
I
a
got
new one.
6 car loans outstanding right now.
Well, hopefully the IRS isn't watching or whoever deals with that. Yeah. Um, yeah, so right, like I think you don't wait until you are at the point of breakdown or at the point of exhaustion or the point of burnout until you go, okay, I need a sabbatical now. I've heard anecdotally stories of guys that have gone on sabbaticals and then never came back to their church. They were like, oh, this is actually really great not having to deal with this. I'm not going to go back because they had been run ragged or run to the point of wanting to be done. So I think, sabbaticals on some regular rhythm to help prevent that, just like you change your oil to prevent the car from seizing up, is kind of somehow I think a good model to kind of view sabbaticals through that lens of trying to be preemptive in our care for ourselves and for our congregation's longevity so that we can be there for another 20, 30, 40 years, depending on what the Lord would have for us.
Mhm.
Yeah, there are ways to promote longevity, and this may be one of those tools, depending on the situation. From Zach Garris here, it's striking. He says that in a day when most Christians have abandoned the weekly Sabbath, some pastors want long-term breaks called sabbaticals. Rest is important, but Zach is saying the sabbatical is maybe should not be emphasized as much as the Sabbath day. Um, what do you think? Does he have a point there?
Well, I think
Well,
the
I
Lord of
feel
the
like
Sabbath told us that he also went and took extended breaks beyond his Sabbath. So I think when he says, I prefer God's way of doing it, I 100% agree with that. I just think that we might have a different opinion on what God's way is. If by that he means simply the only break that a pastor should ever get is the Sabbath, I think Jesus had a pretty robust Sabbath and then also called his disciples and himself for also additional extended times of rest, of prayer, of refreshment, and those sorts of things. So if he's including that in the way God does it, then yeah, I totally agree with him that I prefer the way that God is suggesting to do it. Now, I also agree with them. I don't want to have an abandonment of a weekly Sabbath. I mean, I'm a Sabbatarian. We practice that as a family in our church, and so we're not laboring ourselves on the Lord's Day. We're not doing commerce. We're not going out. We're not engaging in those sorts of activities. So I agree with that. I just think that we don't want to make our standard more holy than Jesus. That would kind of be to sum up the way that I would put it.
Yeah, and as he said in the what he was retweeting, pastors need to toughen up. Is there a problem with weak pastors, George?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I have had to interview and try to hire pastors at 2 churches as I was executive pastor or at 2 churches. And yeah, I don't think the work ethic is the same today. I think there's a high focus on this like supposed work-life balance. And it's not just pastors, it's if churches have staffs. When I was a ruling elder at a church and I was juggling a lot of things, and one individual who was on staff, I was teaching a class for that in an area he was in charge of, and he wanted to meet with me. And I said, well, I can meet. And I gave him options, and every option I gave him, he told me, well, that's my day off. That's my this, that's my that. That's my, no, I'm home at that time. Like, look, bro, you want to meet with me. That's when I can meet. Like, and that's why I tell people, like, you need to accommodate your volunteers and your elders' schedules if you're on staff at a church, because it is true that if I'm at a session meeting till 10:30 at night and I don't have anything the next morning, there's nothing pressing me to be in at 8 a.m. But I had elders that actually had to wake up at 5 a.m. to be in there at 6:30 because they were operations managers of manufacturing plants. And so, like, we need to accommodate people, but like there's this idea in entitlement almost from, I would say, the newer generations. And again, I'm in my 50s. And so, maybe I'm old, that, there's this idea of work-life balance and also the idea of entitlement of things like, a mandatory day off besides, Saturday, and the Lord's Day isn't your day off and you get another one, and then mandatory Sabbaths. And yeah, I grew up with a different work ethic. Of course, my parents were small business owners, and so they could never turn off their business. And I grew up with that, maybe that's a problem I have. And so, with my church, I had an agreement with my session that Mondays was a day off for me. I almost never took it. And it wasn't because anybody was forcing me to do that. It was just, now again, most of the day I had off, but I usually would work a few hours, and I wouldn't not schedule meetings that needed to happen, or meetings with congregants, or what, like, I want to be there for the people that I'm there to serve. But this is something that you just don't have in other fields, where at our church, we had in the 300s. There's a sense that I had like 300 bosses, even though we can say you don't, and you report to the session or whatever. At the end of the day, there's 300 different expectations, 300 group needs. And, pastors actually want to reasonably be there to meet those needs. So, and I found there are pastors that aren't doing that, but for the most part they are. But there's, again, this other idea about work-life balance. And so, and there is the other side where we think we're Jesus Christ and we're going to meet everybody's need. And we can't ever do that either. And so I'm just saying there's unique challenges that we live in, this tension that we want to meet needs and be there for people, but we also know that we physically can't do that. And navigating that is different than in any other job. And when I was at Procter & Gamble, I routinely worked 70-hour weeks. And, I said this on my own episode, but the longest day I ever worked was 36 hours. And it's like, well, a day only is 24. Exactly. I came in at 6 a.m. one day and I didn't leave till 6 p.m. the next day in the manufacturing plant. They had to escort me out. I was a safety hazard, they said. So I know what it is to work hard. And I can tell you that the emotional pressure, see, people think it's hours. It's not hours. It's the emotional pressure that you are dealing with. And I think of Paul in 2 Corinthians 11, where he says, I'm talking like a madman. I've been persecuted this way. I've shipwrecked and beaten and snakes and this. And he goes through this litany of things. You're like, and of course, none of us have ever dealt with that. So we're all soft, right? But at the end of it, he says, and apart from all these things, there's the daily pressure on me of anxiety for all the churches. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, some of those churches are under persecution, but I think it's more than that. He knows the needs and he feels the weight of them. And this is Paul the apostle, who rested and leaned on Christ more than Paul. And even he couldn't shake free of the needs.
Mm. Yeah, it's not a quantity issue, I don't think. I think it's a quality issue. And not to say that other people don't have a quality, but it's a different kind of thing altogether, what pastors are trying to deal with and go through. And much like what you just said, George, my day off is the Lord's Day. I work on Sundays. I work on Saturdays, getting my sermons together, and then Monday morning I start getting my sermon put together for the week. There are no days if somebody says, "Can you meet?" that I say, "No, I can't. That's my day off." I meet with people when and where they can to accommodate them. That doesn't mean that every single day of the week I'm waking up at 5 and clocking out, as it were, at 9 or whatever. Some days are lighter than others, but I'm constantly every day able and doing something for the church. And then, not to mention, even when I'm not directly sitting at my desk, all the things I'm thinking about the different issues in the church, having conversations with my wife about them, talking to other pastoral friends about those issues and getting counsel, thinking through applications for sermons, how to get that best put together, all of that. Even when I'm watching a movie with my family, my brain is only a third watching the movie, if it's even possible. A big chunk of it is thinking through how do I illustrate that point better. I don't like what I have there. I often wake up Lord's Day mornings, and I'm putting final touches on sermons to make sure that they're as best as I can possibly make them. So yeah, but I don't think none of that means. I do think that there may be some lazy pastors out there. I think that the job can kind of create itself to where you could just kind of hide behind it a little bit. But in my experience, at least with my group of friends, that's not the challenge for us. The challenge for us, as I'm seeing, is trying to convince guys they need to pull back. They need to rest more. They need to make sure that they're spending time with their family and their kids. Make sure that their marriages aren't falling apart. That sort of stuff. That's my experience. It's only anecdotal. I've done no research on it, but I can just tell you, in the pastor friends I have, when we're talking to each other, that's my advice is more often, you need to pull back from some of that. I don't think I've ever had to, you know, prod somebody to get moving more in pastoral ministry, from my experience.
When a pastor crashes, he usually crashes bad. And there is a larger radius of damage around a minister than there is around another career where things go bad. And I would say there's more on the line. And for those reasons, I think at least the conversation should be healthy and careful. And I think that the idea of simplistically saying, just toughen up. Spurgeon's got this other quote. I keep pulling out Spurgeon quotes. Sorry, guys. I'm your Spurgeon quote generator today. He's got this quote. He says, "There may be men of iron to whom wear and tear work no perceptible detriment, but surely the rust frets even these. And as for ordinary men, the Lord knows and makes them to know that they are but dust." And so I think, generally speaking, it would be interesting to do an episode about lazy pastors. I think it's interesting how discussions about work ethic ends up becoming a part of this conversation about sabbatical, right? If you've got a strong work ethic and you're working really hard, it feels like this person should be taking a sabbatical, probably because you don't want him to crash out, because that's a valuable man for the kingdom. You want him to be serving longer. But I have known guys that I don't know it for a fact because I'm not following them around, but I do kind of wonder if he might be a lazy pastor. And I wonder if that suspicion that a man might be a lazy pastor sort of causes some, especially in the church, just to say, you know what, these guys don't need sabbaticals, when in reality, you don't want to paint everybody with a broad brush. I think it's best to assume that your pastor is really pouring himself out, especially if you can tell.
That's great.
And Adam, when you say more's on the line for us, I think you mean more, not quantitatively, but qualitatively. That is, we are dealing with the souls of individuals, and there's nothing more precious that we could be handling as kind of our currency or what we're dealing in as pastors than that.
Let me interrupt and explain a little more what I mean. Some of the men that I have known who I consider to be the most serious, the most humorless, the most just go, Energizer bunny, never seen the guy smile, but he works hard. I've been close to those guys, and they are the ones who, I'm not saying they all do it, but what I'm saying is they seem to not have hobbies. They seem not to have anything that they do but church. And it often seems like those are also the guys that end up leaving the ministry, failing in some way, and they usually leave behind a damaged church in the process. That's what I mean by that. You leave behind a crater.
Yeah. And, if you're, the plant manager at the widget factory and you get burned out, they get on LinkedIn and they've replaced you in 2 weeks. But if you are the pastor of a church, you get burned out and you crash, that congregation is in, maybe not free fall, but in a big problem for a year during the pulpit search committee. And that's if nothing else is touched, right? If you haven't abandoned your wife and kids, if you haven't,
right, that's excluding any moral failing that may have happened,
right, as a result of this burnout. And so I think you make a great point that there is more at stake, that elders and church members should just consider, what can we do to encourage this longevity. And
as someone who has, just as you mentioned earlier in the podcast here, as somebody who is on a sabbatical, I found that the vast majority of the people at my church were very, very supportive of this idea. I had a
They want you
number of
around.
people. Yeah,
They
I
still
had a
want you
number of
around
people
at
come up
5.
to me and express appreciation. I had one lady come up and say, I pray for you every day. And I was praying for your sabbatical. And I didn't know that's what I was praying for. I didn't call it your sabbatical, but I was just praying that the Lord would make sure that you stay, that you are strengthened, that you have longevity. And when you announced that you were going on sabbatical, she said, I said to myself, that's the answer to my prayer. That's what I've been praying for him. And I'm so glad that you're able to do that. I had congregants give gifts to me and my family to say, here, enjoy your sabbatical. Go do this, go do that. And some were extravagant. Like I was blown away
Anybody give you a
by it.
gun, a sabbatical gun?
I did not get a sabbatical gun. No. I don't know what a sabbatical gun would be,
That's
but
just
yeah.
Ryan's church.
Oh, yeah.
I guess it's a gun
Uh,
with a silencer on it. I don't know.
oh.
But
Yeah. So I find most
that's
people
wonderful.
have been very encouraging of this from the lady. Now again, that doesn't mean everybody. There's, I think in every congregation there are probably a handful who don't get it for different reasons and various reasons. But the vast majority of people in my colleagues and in the church are very supportive, and I think these are good things to be doing for many of the reasons that we've said today.
Well, as we kind of bring it in for a close, I do want to pick up on something which I think Zach makes a good point. We've alluded to it, but we haven't really talked about it. But as ministers, the Lord's Day is the Lord's Day. The minister's Sabbath isn't Monday. In the main line, the ministers all got Monday off or whatever it was. That's not his Sabbath. The minister's Sabbath is still the Christian Sabbath because presumably the minister is a Christian. But how do we? How does a minister go out of his way to, or intentionally, treat the Lord's Day as his Sabbath, even though, yes, he's working, but he's doing good work and godly work
And necessary work.
necessary work. Yes. How do we do that, George?
Yeah, I mean that's tough. I mean, I would say the Lord's Day was my favorite day as a senior pastor because I was preaching and I just loved to feed people the word. So I that wasn't stressful to me. But again, going back to this idea that it just never it never turns off. So I'm 5 minutes before worship, I have somebody grabbing me about sometimes some stupid thing. And I'm like, I got to get up there and start worship. And you're talking to me about this stupid, I mean, I'll say that, or other times it's a real crisis and it's minutes before worship. And now I'm leading worship and this crisis is on my mind. Or we're announcing a church discipline case on a Sunday morning and I have to communicate this with grace and truth and love. And we would do that at the end. And so here I got to preach this message and then announce this thing, And so there's just emotional, I don't know how to make as a pastor, make the Lord's Day a restful experience. I just didn't. And that's, I see you're like, what do you think? That's just, and two anecdotal stories. So one Mother's Day, obviously it's a Sunday and I'm cooking for my wife and making her a surf and turf meal and my kids and my phone is buzzing and ringing off the hook. I mean, this is the Lord's Day, right? Buzzing and ringing. So I'm turn off the ringer and I finally decide I'm going to but it's on my mind. What crisis is happening, and at 8:30 I call. Now I'm on the phone for an hour, a marginal member of the church, hardly around, but their parent just died and their parent was one of the founding families of the church. And now I'm dealing with, because I heard, I don't know if it was on Zach's tweet or somebody else's, and they said this mythical 3 a.m. call doesn't happen, guys. Stop talking about it. Like the idea that I've had that. I've been out with my kids on the lake and we're water skiing and the same thing. My phone's buzzing off. Like it's a Monday. I'm supposed to be off anyway. People kind of know that. So on the drive home, I engage with it, and these parents, their teenage son ran off with a 35-year-old man. Yes, I had to deal with it. So rather than take my kids out to dinner and do this, I get them home, I shower up from the lake, and I go to church, and I'm there for 3 hours with the family. It never my point is it just doesn't turn off. Now maybe you're in a pastoral situation where you don't have these kinds of problems. That's just 2 stories. I could probably go on and on about
Yeah,
the thing.
I did not see that tweet of the mythical 3 a.m. call. My first year here at my current call, I was woken up to a police officer knocking on my front
Yeah.
door to tell me that one of my ruling elders had committed suicide and
Yeah.
having to deal with that.
And this doesn't
So,
happen
like,
in normal people's jobs. It just
yeah,
doesn't,
yeah. So like that tweet is a little, just think it's a little misguided. If you think, or if it's a pastor that put that tweet out, it's coming. It's that 3MA call is coming. It may not have happened to you yet or for you yet, but it will come. And you wake up and you figure out what to do at 3 a.m. when you're driving over to meet a widow now, of a church you just took the call of. You don't really know the family that well yet. You're new there, and the things that you have to deal with as pastors are sometimes things that normal people, I don't like the word normal, non-pastor people would
There is
never
nothing
even
normal about us, Josh.
that they would think about. And I think that's good in some sense. Like I don't want you to have to deal with that. That's what we signed up for, is being in people's lives, being in the depth and the highs and the lows of their life, being there for all of it. But I just don't think that they really understand what that's like to have to deal with those sorts of things, and that those things actually do happen.
Ryan, you asked that question though about how do you keep Sunday, restful, and I think George is right. It's physically it's exhausting. I mean, I really, if you pour yourself into your preaching, then my family can testify. I come home and I'm just a bump, because I've spent myself. I've given everything I've got for this message that I preached, and I'm praying that it'll bring fruit. But you never know. It's God that does the growing anyway. But like, at least for me, the thing I found was, if I'm in a church where I really feel like I'm a fit, I don't feel like I have to perform. So what they're seeing from me on Sunday, Lord willing, is the real me. It's not I got to put on the mask, got to get myself psyched up, got to get myself ready. And if you're in a ministerial context, it's really stressful like that, and people put those kind of pressures on you. You have my sympathy. I'm super grateful that I'm in a church where I feel like I belong, I'm a fit, and I just go in as myself, and I just do what I would have done on a Sunday, minus, but with preaching. And because before I did this, I was there and I was invested, and I would teach Sunday. I wanted to be useful. And so now I get to be paid to be useful. It's a dream. It's a dream job. But I do think that if you're performing, you're going to be more drained. Everybody's disposition is just different. So the idea that like one person goes and says Sunday's great, and another guy says, I'm completely wrung out on a Sunday, I'm not going to judge you. But the idea that everybody's going to have the same disposition, oh, well, I'm having an easy time, so everyone else should be. Something must be wrong with you. It's like, come on, man, have some grace. Just have some grace.
But I do think that if yes, you're going to have some rough Sundays, some Sundays where you are utterly exhausted because there's been a crisis, there's been this, there's been that. I mean, we had such a full Lord's Day. We had people over for dinner, over for lunch. It was great. Preached twice, and it was tiring, but it was also invigorating, and it was restful because we're encouraging one another in the Lord. We're telling each other about these things that we are feeling called to do in service, and but I do think that there should be an aspect of the Lord's Day that is restful, even for ministers, even if it's a day of holy activity. If the emphasis is holy resting or holy working, it may be more on the holy working side. But I still got a little 10-minute nap in my office on the Lord's Day. I came in, I'd gone over the evening sermon, turn off the light, stick my feet up on a chair, and it was restful. Physically.
Naps are great on the Lord's Day.
Yes, especially if it's raining. Well, anything else as we close?
Yeah, I guess I would just say if you're watching this and you're not in the ministry, I would encourage you to seek ways to maybe help your pastor get a sabbatical. Maybe if it's nothing less than just stating that you would be in favor of it for them. As somebody who went on a sabbatical recently, having the congregation express their um, kind of support for this was very encouraging. I was pretty trepidatious going into it of how is this going to be perceived? How are people going to respond to this? That was very encouraging and really set a good tone for me walking into a sabbatical. And if you are a pastor watching this who's kind of wondering about this, um, I really do think that's something you should consider doing. I think that it's good. It's helpful. I'll tell you at the end of it how it all kind of falls out, how it all shakes out on the wash. But at least up to this point, I'm excited about it and continuing to look forward to what the Lord does for me and my family in this time of rest.
And I hope you're excited about the return.
Very much so. Yeah. Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's hard. You guys know me personally, at least most of you do. I'm a people person. I love being around people. It's hard to not be around my people. Like it's hard. That's not an easy thing to just walk away and go, okay, for these 10 weeks I'm off. I've built relationships with people, some of them, for 7 years. They're close friends. And to say, hey, I'm gonna be off the grid for 10 weeks, that's not an easy task to do that. So I've been calling Adam a lot more than I normally do, and he can attest to that.
I'm really glad to hear that you've become a people person, because you were not a people person at RTS Jackson.
I remember having you over for breakfast early mornings to pray.
I remember you complained that I got the discount version of cinnamon rolls instead of the Pillsbury graham.
I do remember that. Yeah.
But on the subject of complaints, I'm sure this episode may generate some. So if there are complaints, please send them to Scott Edberg, 1928 S.R. Bradley R. Smith Drive in Troy, Illinois. You can send your complaints there.
Wow.
But anything else?
I like Scott.
Oh, Scott's a great guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
But anything else as we close, other than send your complaints to Scott Edberg?
Yeah, I mean, if
anybody
thinks I'm soft and all this, I've never had a sabbatical, so I just see how they could be beneficial. So
he swears to his own hurt.
Yeah. And again, I hope this doesn't come across as whining and grumbling, but just an encouragement to our colleagues on the one hand, our ministerial colleagues, teaching elder colleagues, that you need to not be afraid to take a sabbatical, as well as that weekly rhythm of Sabbath rest, but also to our ruling elder colleagues. And just like my first clerk of session said to me, make sure that you don't end up in the hospital for 5 to 10 days because of exhaustion. And a sabbatical may be one of the ways that you can encourage that. Well, Adam Parker, George Sayour, and Joshua Walker, thank you for joining the program today.
Thanks for having us.
You bet.
Yeah, thanks for having me after a year or whatever it is.
It's been too long. It's been too long for all of you. We'll have to do an overture preview roundup or something. Thanks for joining the conversation on the Westminster Standard, which is the podcast of Jude 3. For more information or to support our work at promoting confessional renewal within the Presbyterian Church in America, please visit our website, jude3pca.org. Join us again next time. I'll talk to you then.